Welcome, everybody, to this month's OPSWAT Academy webinar. I'm Nate Medeiros, the product owner of OPSWAT Academy, and I am thrilled to have here today George. George, can you introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
I surely can, Nate. Thank you for having me. My name is George. I work as a sales engineering manager at OPSWAT.
And how long have you been here?
I've been with OPSWAT 6 years.
All right, so you've seen some customer environments, you've seen some things. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about some of the use cases and some of the ideas and concepts that it pertains to our subject today of data at rest. So for everybody in the webinar, the concept today that we want to discuss is the idea of files and folders residing already within your organization. It's a pretty often overlooked area of cybersecurity because we often think if we have a secure perimeter around our infrastructure, then once the data is there, it's safe. But that's really not the case. And George, you want to maybe start talking a little bit as to, why we still need to, worry about and have secure practices for data that's already been scanned as it made its way into our network?
Yeah, 100%. Like you said in the introduction, most customers just focus on securing the data as the data comes into the network, and then they check the box and then they think it's all good, they're safe. When actually the data is in the network, right? It can be there for a lot longer. It can be there for years, depending on the customer's policies that they need to be compliant with. And they obviously have to have a mechanism that continuously analyzes that data for malware, especially in the light of more targeted attacks, especially aiming towards critical infrastructure. So definitely there has to be a process on how data is handled once it's been imported into the network. And we're not talking only about archiving and things that are already implemented, but we're talking here about malware protection against those files, and we shouldn't only rely on things like endpoint protection.
But why though? Like, what's the reasoning to say if I have a strong border protection and then I have a file that I put in my network and I open it 2 years later, why would I need to worry about it 2 years later if I already scanned it?
That's a good point. So we probably all know and can acknowledge there's nothing like 100% detection. And the reason we see that many 0 days and breaches out there, it's because there's no solution that can fix all the security challenges a customer has. That being said, scanning the file today doesn't mean the file is going to be clean for the entire lifetime of that file in the network. And like back to my point with targeted attacks and very, very sophisticated attacks, those can evade the perimeter and all the security controls that might have been implemented in the perimeter already. Let's take the example of a 0 day. Right? It's called a 0 day because it can't be detected in day 0. But if you just scan it or analyze it with different technologies when it's being imported, and they all say it's safe, right? You get green check mark, then you're going to assume that file is going to be safe for maybe a year in your network.
Or just at that point in time, right? Like at that
point in time.
Yeah, at that moment,
exactly.
This file is good to me. So it's not like the file's changing. It's just the detection mechanisms at that point in time said everything was good.
Correct. Yeah, and there's multiple factors that somehow work towards that result. But because we, more and more companies and we as vendors try to change the mindset, and customers do that as well with the assume breach policy. Obviously, that somehow aligns with what you have to do with the data after it's being imported and it's at rest in your network. And as a best practice, you should analyze it regularly. after it's been imported and it's at rest, just to be able to uncover a potential outbreak, right? That file changing, it's not the file that changes, it's the detection that evolves and improves over time. And that file might be picked up a couple of days, weeks, months, years.
Let me ask you about that. So what exactly is changing? If we're saying that a file's coming in and we're scanning it and all the checkboxes are green saying everything's good to go, and we're saying you should scan it again if within your network, because it might not be green when you scan it again. What exactly is changing on that second time around?
There's a couple of things that will change throughout time. One is the detection capabilities on the detection technologies. Right? Here we're talking antivirus engines in different shapes and forms. Right? That can be your EDR, your traditional endpoint solution, or it can be a solution that combines multiple of those AV engines. Those vendors, obviously, they improve their detection over time. They release new signatures, new algorithms to detect advanced malware as those attacks surface. And obviously, the detection of those solutions would improve. And we need to leverage those improvements in the technology for the data at rest to be able to potentially discover threats that exist dormant in the network.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point there. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. You mentioned two really critical aspects with the AV vendors. Is one's those definitions, and the other one is the detection algorithms. You know, those are the real meat and potatoes of what we're bringing to the table when we're saying that you should rescan these files because those things are changing. You know, here at OPSWAT, we don't create our own antivirus engines. We utilize antivirus engines in multiple ways through multiple form factors, and combine them so that we're scanning a single file against 5, 10, 20 engines. Each of those companies, each of those vendors, you know, whether if it's McAfee or Avast or any of them, they have their own process, right, to update their engine. So let's break this down into two subjects because I don't want to lose track. I first want to talk about the antivirus definitions, and then I want to talk a little bit about those detection algorithms and what those look like as we talk about them colloquially. So definitions. I mean, this is something that you know, the antivirus companies themselves are constantly updating, right? So what's a really high level uh, perspective as to what's actually happening there with those antivirus definitions, just from you know, the actual vendor themselves all the way getting to at some kind of endpoint detection tool.
Yeah, those AV vendors, they would release so-called signature updates. It's essentially, in many cases, a pattern matching or some sort of heuristic algorithm that allows them to discover a known attack, a known piece of threat. Right? And they obviously do that on a daily basis. They might do it multiple times a day. They might do it several times a week. Each vendor has their own cadence in terms of releasing those signatures, right? Those definition updates.
And that's really important too to consider, as to why you may not want to, even if there's it's antivirus vendor that has a cadence of every other day, that file that you scan, that was 0 day that they're working on updating their engines for, that might not be detected for 2 days because their cadence is, you know, not every day, where maybe another vendor does do pushes every day, and you know, they would see it. So that's another big reason why we're a big advocate for scanning against not just one, not having that single point of failure.
It is, exactly. And you know, that becomes a real problem when you're only using one AV vendor, like you said, right? And then we're trying to move away from that and use the crowdsourced intelligence of different AV vendors. And what we do is we also choose them and package them in a way where we distribute them globally. What I mean with that is when we create the packages of our multi-scanning offering, we tend to choose vendors from different parts of the world in the same package. So our customers always have a geographical distribution of those AV vendors and their research facilities. I usually tell customers a story, right? And that's a real life story. It's the story of Olympic Destroyer. It is a malware that was targeting the Olympic Games in South Korea. I think it was in 2018, if I'm not wrong. And that just happened after Russia was discovered, or the Russian athletes was discovered doping, and they were banned from attending the games. So it was the first edition of the Olympic Games without Russia being present. So what they did, they retaliated, right? So what they actually did, they created this piece of malware, which now the industry knows as Olympic Destroyer. And they obviously targeted the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure of the company that organized the Olympics. The company that provided the security services was a company called Anlab. It's a security vendor. They also have an endpoint product that's not very well known in Europe or the US. So chances of customers using that product on their endpoint are really small in this part of the world. But they were the ones that are the ones that responded to the incident. They managed to release a signature update that was able to detect that piece of threat. Right, and like always happens, you can't really contain the malware in a specific geolocation or a specific network. So that malware started spreading and affected customers in other parts of the world, in Europe and in the Americas. And because we leverage that AV vendor, we were able to. Exactly. Anlab was part of the OPSWAT offering, and we were able to leverage that new detection capability that was added into the product. The other vendors might have, and they probably caught up in the following days, but we were able to provide that detection capability to customers. And that's where, having a multi-AV strategy really shows its benefits, really.
Right. We have a question here from the audience. It's actually pretty relevant to your story that you just told. It's how do AV vendors decide which definitions to upload to their databases? So you actually mentioned this when you talked about the research labs. So some vendors do this in different ways. Sometimes they have large automated sandboxes that are just constantly scanning new threats that research teams gather, but oftentimes, especially for high profile, there's going to be boots on the ground, somebody that's actually trying to analyze in that as well. So that's so George's story kind of covered that with a really good use case of maybe a vendor that's not so well known, that their research team got that definition to their platform before all the other big players did. And because that was part of our offering, the suite of AVs that we use in our scanning solutions was more effective than a big name player like Norton or McAfee on its own. So that's kind of like a big part of our philosophy as to why we don't rely on just one vendor. So I think that's a pretty good grasp as to definitions as to what they are. They're quick and easy signatures that we can reference just by looking at the flat information about the file and comparing that to a signature from the antivirus definition. Now you mentioned also algorithms, and these can change with different AV vendors with different approaches. One of the biggest, I think, the easiest ones to address here is the way that AV engines handle heuristics differently. When we talk about a heuristic does have a few different meanings in the world of malware analysis or malware scanning. Here, we're explicitly using the term for the static analysis portion, not the heuristic dynamic. And what I mean by that is we're looking at typically segments of compiled code of whatever the file is, and that's going to uh, change depending on how the AV vendors decide what to look at and what to do with those different portions of those files. So, you can almost think of it as windowing a magnifying glass, because if I say this little bit of code is going to flag a file as malware, well, the smaller I get, the more likely I'm going to see that with all kinds of files. And then we see false positives all the time, and then that's not a very effective solution if I can't trust my AV vendor to tell me that that's really malware, if it's overly suspicious. Or at the same time, if I'm too broad, then I might miss something because the hacker changes just a little bit of the code, and now it's no longer matching my heuristic pattern matching, and now it's not any better than just the regular static. So they're constantly adjusting these pattern matching recognition of the heuristic engines as well, and those algorithms that they use to identify and weight and classify files as malware, even if it doesn't directly match a signature. That's what we're talking about when we're saying heuristic static analysis, and that's what George, the other half of that coin that George mentioned, is those are constantly getting updated as well, because they're constantly tweaking the effectiveness of those algorithms and of those search patterns. Um, so that in itself, we've talked almost 15 minutes just about those two little elements about data at rest. It's such an important aspect to it. So let's back up a little bit more, and look at the general big picture that we're talking about today. So we have a file that is um, within our network, and we know that if I scan this thing in 2 weeks from now, or even 4 days later, I might not have the same result that I had when I first originally scanned that file. So just taking OPSWAT out of out of the general conversation for now, just as a conceptual idea from an IT administrator, what do I need to do in order to set up a process that's actually going to be able to protect myself and my organization from this kind of scenario that we find ourselves in?
Yeah. So the easiest way to do it is implement a scheduled scan or some sort of regular scan of the data set, of the data that's at rest. That can be done through your endpoint solution. Obviously, we've discussed why that might not be sufficient, but it's a good starting point, right? And you also have to consider what happens when your AV or when your detection technology manages to detect something as malicious. Has to be part of a bigger process. And obviously, integration and automation it's really essential in this case. Ideally, those logs should be sent to the SOC team, and the SOC team should be able to act on it and potentially start an incident response based on that type of data that's provided by the detection technology. But the first and the most essential first step is implement that regular scanning. And then the interval, it would be determined based on ideally how often the antivirus engines get new detection capabilities, right? It can be every 2 days, it can be maybe once a week. It also depends on how big the data set is. There's a couple of things that you have to consider, but the bottom line is start implementing a mechanism where you rescan regularly the data set.
Now, if we consider it, the data itself is already residing somewhere. And a lot of use cases might not be directly needed by the end user at that time. Is this a good opportunity to use something like sandboxing or file emulation to get, detonation events? Is this a good place for us to work that in? Because one of the biggest challenges with sandboxing is finding a an appropriate location at the life cycle of some kind of data
Yeah,
flow. So
it
maybe
is.
you can
And
talk
you
a little bit about that.
100%, and you bring a really good point here. Now, storage vendors have different mechanisms of allowing you to implement that continuous analysis of files. Obviously, they allow you to schedule scans, but you can also implement a scan at the moment when someone accesses the file, and that's where you can't use a sandbox because users will have to wait for the analysis. But you bring a good point in trying to fold the sandbox analysis into the picture when the files are not being used. So the end users don't really have, there's no impact on the end user and the responsiveness of that file. And because sandbox is a more expensive process in terms of resources and time, it should be used when there's no time constraints for the users. Ideally, it can be done overnight, and obviously sandboxing, like I said, takes longer than AV detection and AV scanning, and we probably want to maybe look at the very big data set and somehow split it in smaller chunks, so we can do this every night. And literally, you'll have a worker pushing files through the sandbox every single night. And then once you do that, you start from the beginning. And you can implement the same with the AV engines as well.
Right, and by worker you mean automated process to go through
Yeah.
my data. So
Correct. Yeah,
not somebody staying up late at night. It's uploading one file at a time. Um,
preferably.
yeah, um, yeah. I think that's a really good point too, because this approach, the sandboxing approach or the file emulation approach, where we're actually detonating the malware, that doesn't have the same limitations when we talk about those algorithms and we talk about those signatures. It doesn't rely on either of those things. It's able to detect, detonate and detect for itself um, whether or not the file is showing malicious behavior. And we have new approaches to malware itself has gotten more advanced over the years, where it can detect that it's in a virtual machine and not run its payload and then therefore not get detected by a particular sandbox. But to combat that, we have new solutions such as file emulation in a sandbox, which uh, will still run through the different stages of the file and execute its behavior regardless if it detects if it's a virtual machine or not, because it's still going through those different stateless or those different stages of the file execution. So we're able to get more information that way, and that bypasses that those advancements of the malware sandbox detection. So but either way, there's still, like you said, that the responsiveness issue. So we either have the AVs that are there to do the scan so quickly that we don't even notice it, or we have some kind of detonation mechanism, but that doesn't fit well with the user experience. If I need my file now, I don't want to wait, especially for traditional sandbox. I don't want to wait, minute and a half or 2 minutes
And yeah,
for that thing to actually get to me. So yeah, if we can somehow find a way to incorporate that with data that's already within our network, just sitting there within storage, and maybe run through those, period, like as a waterfall down through our internal storage network, and then cycle back. That's an ideal scenario because you're getting both. And then, like you mentioned before, having some kind of centralized place to get notifications, whether it's an AV scan or with a sandbox type scan, a dynamic scan, um, that these are getting found. But I mean, ultimately, that's a very difficult um, infrastructure to establish, to set up. All those
it,
moving pieces, right?
it is 100%. And It's probably something we need to also make it clear here on the sandbox. There's going to be limitations no matter what sandboxing technologies you're going to use. Not all file types will be supported. There's usually file size limits, and you can't solely rely on sandboxing for that. So the strategy should include different technologies that can complement each other for files that can't be analyzed by one. So you have to have a layered approach, right? A defense in depth approach when it comes to protecting the data at rest.
Right, which is a concept that I think we've brought up on almost every interview that I've had so far. It's a motif that we have within the cybersecurity industry, but it's also almost like a fractal where you have a general layered approach, but then you look at one of those layers, and if you really look at it, there's layers within the layers.
Yeah.
We data at rest you consider another as one of your layers of overall security, but you look at how you approach that, and there's stages to that as well. I mean, there's a reason why we, especially when we're talking about infrastructure and those critical environments, even in the official terminology, the practice is malware mitigation. It's not malware elimination, because
Correct.
you can't reliably say that with anything. There's always going to be some new threat vector that is going to be exploited or that nobody knows about yet that's waiting around the corner. So what can we do to absolutely mitigate those scenarios? So that's really oh, go ahead.
And to your point, I do consider cybersecurity is not about eliminating threats. It's all about making a breach as difficult as possible and deterring the attackers, because you can't provide 100% security, right? It can't be done even through a defense in depth strategy. There's still going to be pieces of malware that can get through. But if you make it as difficult as possible, they're going to be put off in terms of attacking your specific organization.
Right, or just be limited as to what they can actually do once the breach does
happen. Correct.
Yeah, that's why we have other, general best practices as well with network layering, segmentation, the multiple stages of analysis. We mentioned that we're talking now about the data that's residing within non-volatile memory within our network. But then there's other mechanisms we're using to, scan for malware that might be running on the volatile memory of your PC, or going through your perimeter, or being sent via email. There's so many different things that we can do to make sure the entire data workflow ecosystem within an organization at least has some kind of mechanism that's protecting those elements. And when you culminate all those things together, the probability of of any kind of breach doing significant damage goes way down. And that's the general philosophy with what we try to solve. So going back to the data at rest, I'm actually really excited to have you on this call because you've been with OPSWAT for 6 years, and I'm sure you've seen some really interesting use cases that might paint a picture as to the problem that we're talking about and the problem that we're trying to solve here. And I know you can't bring in any specific customer names, so we're gonna leave that out of the request here. But do you have any examples of one of our customers that was trying to address this particular kind of challenge, and then what the general over solution was to address it?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's customers from different industries. When we start talking, in many cases, we're talking about protecting data in motion, right, in the perimeter. But then as the discussion evolves, we bring up this subject, right? What happens with the data after it's being stored, right? Yes, we can protect and we can analyze the data in motion. And like you said, different ways the data gets into the network. We have a solution for that. But then we also have to look at this. And the good thing with OPSWAT technology is that customers can leverage the system in protecting both data in motion and data at rest. Like with the same setup, during the day, they can analyze the data in motion. During the night, they can analyze the data at rest. It's just another integration point from our perspective. And there's also a part of education that we're doing with customers where we, like I said, the focus point is protecting against file-based threats that come into the network, right? And after we solve that for customers, we then look at ways to implement that continuous scanning mechanism for the data at rest. We can do that through different ways, especially for finance customers. We do that by integrating to their storage, and that can be on-premise storage, and we can do that by leveraging our ICAP product. A lot of the traditional storage vendors, on-premise storage vendors, I mean, they support ICAP as an interface, which allows us to offload that file analysis to a dedicated system like OPSWAT. And through that interface, we can schedule the scan on regular intervals. We can also enforce a scan on access of that file. But finance customers, if we're discussing about that type of industry, they have a really mature cloud adoption. And they shift from using on-premise storage to cloud object storage. And obviously, when you move into the cloud, there is a shared responsibility model that you have to be aware of. The vendor provides you the infrastructure, but you're in charge of the security of your own data in that infrastructure. It's not going to be the cloud vendor that gets breached. It's going to be you as a business in the end. And we've seen.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah, sure.
Just from your experience with the cloud storage, if I'm somebody like Google Drive or Dropbox or a cloud storage vendor, am I not going to have built-in mechanisms that's going to detect malicious files that I'm uploaded? Because when you say my own security for my files, I can accept that I might have my own credit card information on there, or other sensitive data that I could easily accidentally share with the wrong person, and that's entirely my fault. But shouldn't these large cloud solutions have like anti-malware solution scanning properties already in place with them, or is that typically something you don't see?
Some vendors do provide that out of the box. Like if we're talking OneDrive, there is some sort of antivirus detection that's part of the license. Most of the cloud object storage vendors, they don't provide anything.
So they don't care. They don't care if we're uploading malicious files to their.
Correct. I mean, it's your responsibility to secure that infrastructure in the end, right? It's your infrastructure. It just runs in the cloud in the end, right? They do provide you the means to secure it. They usually have marketplaces where you can integrate different kind of solutions into the storage, the cloud object storage to scan those files, but it's the customer's responsibility to do that. And we've seen so many examples where threat actors use unsecure S3 buckets to host the malware, or use it as an infrastructure to spread the malware, or as a control infrastructure for the malware operation. Right. And that's simply because there's no built-in security out of the box, right? In many of those.
And I suppose there kind of has to be, if you think about it as well, because how frustrating would it be to be using Amazon S3 for my development project, and I'm uploading, segments of my code or some certain files to my project, and the S3 built-in anti-malware feature blocks my files, and all of a sudden I don't know what's not working and where. So I guess there is, there definitely are some valid reasons why you really want to avoid false positives with a cloud storage solution. Perhaps the best approach that they've come up with really is to take their hands off the wheel and say, that's your responsibility as an end user.
And I do understand this, right? Because in the end, it's the customer that wants to decide what technologies they choose to protect their own business. And the vendors, the big cloud vendors, just leave it up to the customer to decide what goes in there. But again, right, it has to be secured one way or another. And don't want to repeat this, but it is the customer's responsibility to do that, and they should be doing it.
Right. Okay. So this is something that you've seen a lot with and heavy adoption with the finance industry, and
Yeah.
And is this posing more of a challenge dealing with cloud vendors versus on-prem? Is it or is it this the same approach, different environment kind of situation?
I wouldn't say it's a challenge for us, especially at OPSWAT. We have products that natively integrate into all those popular cloud object storage vendors. So from an integration perspective, it's actually quite simple. It's just finding the right integration point and building a process after that. The good thing with the native integrations that we provide is that it just works on the back end. There's no difference in the end user experience. The users still upload their files to their S3 buckets, OneDrive accounts, and so on. And we do the analysis behind the scenes, and we can automate some actions based on those results of the analysis. So should the file be malicious, we can move it to a quarantine location, we can delete it, and so on and so forth. Right. I would say maybe it becomes a bit more challenging when we do this type of implementation in critical infrastructure customers, because there, there's a lot more. You have to be a lot more careful with what you do with the data. Sometimes, even if the data is malicious, you might not want to delete it because it can halt some of the processes that exist there. And in many cases, we just want to flag this. And forensics, of course. Yeah. In many cases, we just want to flag it, and then the customer will decide based on that file and that process what's going to happen with that specific threat. They might just choose to contain it and leave it there.
That's a huge game changer. That's so important, because if we are now talking about critical infrastructure facilities, or even any critical system that's using cloud storage, in any sense, unless it's, I guess, unless at the absolute minimum you're talking about, a 3-stage backup, and that's just one of the stages. Outside of that particular use case, you're changing your entire traditional perimeter workflow, and those traditional network perimeters are really where we still see, in critical infrastructure. That's where we see it the most. A lot of enterprise companies, corporations, huge shift to cloud infrastructure. Even Active Directory services are now moving to Azure. Yeah. Some people are, getting off of that particular type of user management entirely. You rarely see localized file servers within buildings anymore. Now you're using cloud services, especially with work from home environments. That even that initial picture that we drew at the beginning of this call, when we talked about scanning a file at that point of entry, and then now it's in our storage, that type of use case isn't even there for a lot of these scenarios with companies that are using storage as cloud storage as their primary mechanisms of sharing files. Yeah. So now that data at rest is your point. That is the place where the first touch happens with the analysis, and that's a hugely important point, I think, to bring up here, that the overall shift between the traditional network perimeter and how we handle data passing in and where it's stored, it's not cut and dry. There's all kinds of different use cases for it, and this is a really big one.
Yeah, and I've seen this week and last week, I've been working with a customer in the manufacturing space, automotive to be more specific, and they slowly open up to using cloud services. And what we're doing is we're securing their data at rest from their file servers and SMB shares, and migrating that into the cloud, right? And again, securing data at rest becomes even more important here when you move your data into the cloud, right? You start fresh, you build a new infrastructure. You don't want to be transferring malware that might have existed in the on-premise infrastructure into your new cloud infrastructure. How can you do that? Well, you need to analyze that on-premise data before you migrate it. And we facilitate that with our MetaDefender for secure storage product, where we can implement that continuous rescan and then the migration itself through just one product.
Well, there we go. So that's one particular use case, because the general use case of MetaDefender for secure storage is to have that periodic rescan for my existing cloud solutions. So is this just a customer where they are currently in the process of migrating all of their files, and we're setting up that rescan there, or scanning the files on the way?
So we're scanning the files on their on-premise storage for a while now, and slowly migrating some of that data into their cloud. And that's going to be a process that will go on for a couple of months from now. It's obviously they're going to run hybrid for probably a couple of years. They can't get rid of all the on-premise infrastructure as you might expect. But the bottom line is we do that for the on-premise, we do that for the cloud, right? Same strategy has to apply because it's the same data at rest. It just resides in a different place, but it's still internal users accessing that data. And if the file is malicious, the company can get breached. Doesn't really matter where that file is.
Right. We have a question here from an audience member. If malware is just sitting in static storage, is it even a threat anyway? Oh, that's a great question. So what do we mean by the issues of actually having malware residing in static storage? And what's I guess George, maybe let's go over a scenario in which a file that we at the time of entry it was flagged as clean, and then we do something with it later on.
Yeah, usually for an attack to happen, an action is needed, and usually that action is to open the file. That's in probably almost every case where you have to have someone opening the file for the attack to happen. There are multiple stages attacks where the threat actor would try to split the payload into different stages. And then once it's been delivered to the network, all the pieces are put together and the attack would carry on. And if we're talking about critical infrastructure, that's mainly to steal data. That's the main reasoning behind the attack. Less so with destructive consequences, right? Mm-hmm. I would say in most of the cases, users would have to open the file, right? But they would eventually do that, right? After it's not like users only use the file the day you transfer it, right? If it's, let's take an example of a user guide or some sort of document with instructions that's being used in critical infrastructure, right? The engineers won't memorize all the instructions, especially if it's an equipment that's not used on a daily basis. So if we transfer a PDF document, let's say, that has some sort of malicious code inside, they're going to open that document, that user guide, probably, I don't know, every month or so, and that attack will happen at some point.
Right, and that could be doing something simple like just taking a snapshot of their screen and sending it off somewhere.
Exactly, it can be.
Eventually, they might find something, valuable enough to get into a VPN, or any number of things.
Exactly. Yeah, it does. Like I said, it doesn't have to be destructive, right? Usually threat actors would keep it low profile for a long time during their recon phase until they understand the network architecture and what are the weak points and where's the valuable information. And obviously, they want to fly under the radar in that period. And we've seen different studies that show for how long a file can go undetected in a network, and it's north of 180 days almost always. So,
right. I mean, especially if you're talking about critical infrastructure environments as well, because when you're mentioning somebody opening a user guide, I mean, they might be running Windows XP, because that's what that Modbus controller system on that human machine interface is using. So you can't even rely on modern local antivirus to catch
correct.
really basic malware if they're if they it somehow got through and it's sitting in storage.
Yeah, and I've had many discussions with customers in this space where they know there is something malicious in the network, but they can't do anything about it, because if they delete some of those files, a process is going to stop, and they just need to control it somehow, right? And the more data they know about that malicious activity, the better off they are.
Right. They have some kind of operation fully isolated.
Correct.
Not propagating to the entire network, but it's still doing the job that they need. Yeah, that's an unfortunate reality within a lot of the infrastructure sector that I've also seen. But yeah, that's very, very interesting. I think that's a good answer to the question. I believe some use cases as to why for the user who asked, even if the file's sitting there not doing anything, it doesn't mean that down the road it won't do something catastrophic. So there's always that risk, and this whole concept of ensuring that the data at rest is still being scanned. It's to avoid those kind of scenarios where later down the road, a malicious file, a malicious package isn't opened in a vulnerable or inopportune moment as we go through.
Correct, especially when you think about customers that have mandates to store the data for 7 years, 5 years, and so on, and they undergo regular audits where the auditors might actually have to look through those files to do their job. So I would say there's plenty of opportunities for those files to be executed at some point during that file life cycle. We should be focusing on how to secure those, rather than is there a chance for those to actually detonate and create some issues in the network.
Got it. All right, thank you. Well, George, I usually like to give the guest speaker a little bit of time to talk about the products that are relevant to the conversations that we've had here. I typically save it for 5 minutes at the end, but since there's actually 2 products that I want to give a high level overview here, I'd like to hear a little bit about Metadefender Vault and Metadefender for secure storage, and the unique approaches and use cases that's relevant to the concepts we talked about here today. You mind
Sure.
taking the floor with that?
I'll gladly do that. So let's start with Metadefender Vault. Essentially, Vault, it's an integral part of our cross-domain solution set, where we have the kiosk in the DMZ and the perimeter that would scan data from portable media as that data goes into the network. So there's one security control for the data in motion, or for the data being transferred into the network. And then the Vault does the second part, right? It stores the files on the long term. It provides a nice user interface where the file can be retrieved for. But most importantly, it can, with a click of a button, implement that continuous rescanning. There's a feature on the Vault, we call it outbreak prevention, and it does exactly that. It tries to prevent outbreaks by continuously analyzing those files. And we do that by using different technologies. I think it's been mentioned throughout the webinar. We do multi-scanning, but we also do next-generation sandboxing based on emulation. And we can leverage both those technologies in analyzing the data at rest in that usually secure facility, a secure network, right? The other benefit of Vault is that it provides full audit trail where we can get information about the source, the IP, and the user that has downloaded that file, that change status. So then an incident response can start. The incident response team would be able to locate the file immediately in the network by just looking at the Vault logs. That's a really simple and really powerful way of implementing that best practice when it comes to securing data at rest, especially in secure facilities. The other product we've been mentioning so far, it's Meta Defender for Secure Storage. And I think the name gives it away. It's essentially connecting to different interfaces to secure data at rest. And that can be an SMB interface for on-premise networks. It can be an SFTP interface. It will very soon be an NFS interface, but it can be the native cloud object storage, the likes of Amazon S3 buckets, Google object storage, Alibaba object storage, you name it, all the popular ones. What the product does, obviously, it does act on new files being created on that storage that we're monitoring. So first, it does scan and analyze the files as they're being created on the storage. But then, again, really simply through the user interface, we can implement a scheduler where we choose how often we want to scan the entire data storage for the files that exist at rest, and then take actions based on those results. All while providing all the logging necessary to the security operation center, so they can get that valuable information and do something about that malware that's being detected. With your permission, I'd like to also speak about ICAP, because it somehow fits into this picture by integrating with the likes of Dell Isilon, Hitachi Vantara, and so on. So many other on-premise storage solutions.
You're a sales engineer at heart, George. You just want to keep running with all the products. You got kiosk in there. You might as well also talk about ICAP. So.
Yeah, exactly. But it does that, right? It does allow customers to connect to their on-premise storage through an interface, a native interface called ICAP, and implement that continuous scan through a scheduler. So there's multiple products at OPSWAT that would help us define a strategy together with the customers on how that data at rest should be secured. All of them have their pros and cons. All of them fit a specific use case, and it's the sales engineering team that would design the solution together with the customers on what product is the best for their approach. It can be a combination of multiple products. I've done projects where we've used both Vault and MDSS to scan data at rest and transfer it between networks, where we wanted to have some sort of a nice user interface for regular users to use, and we used Vault. And then when we had admins and we just wanted automation, we use MDSS to transfer data between networks or between storage units, and obviously scan the data regularly. Yeah, that's 10,000 feet overview
Right.
of the three products that we have that would be able to solve those challenges that we've been discussing.
The bottom line is that every network's different and unique, but we make sure that we have the tools to handle data at rest in all its forms.
Correct.
Yeah, very good. All right, George. Well, thank you so much for your time. For those of you that we didn't get to answer the questions, we'll follow up with you after the call via email. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in another OPSWAT Academy webinar, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, George, again. All right. Goodbye.
Thank you, Nate. Bye-bye.